Italians have been a part of the New Orleans mystique since the founding of the colony by the French in 1718. Throughout time, the Italians made a substantial contribution to the development of the local fabric. But although the Italian people contributed greatly to the culture of the region, stereotypical portraits began to emerge in the late 19th century that proved not only detrimental to Italian assimilation into American society, but also scarred the Italian people as an inherently criminal ethnicity. It was the whites' beliefs in the criminality of Italians that justified the violent bias and prejudice against the Mediterranean ethnicity. Despite the widespread belief that all Italians had some affiliation with an underworld criminal enterprise, there were those who strived to break free from the dark cloud that hung over the Italian people as a whole. Peter Lamanna was one of those early immigrants to struggle and finally succeed at his chosen profession, undertaker. In the early evening of June 8, 1907, Mrs. Peter Lamanna called all of her children to the table for the nightly family dinner. Despite the merciless heat and humidity of New Orleans summers, children of the city cherished the time of endless playing, running around the local neighborhoods in bare feet. When Mrs. Lamanna noticed that her son did not respond to her first call, she wailed again to see if perhaps he was near. An hour passed, then another, and still no little Walter Lamana. A local search party scoured the neighborhood in search of the 7-year-old, but to no avail. Peter Lamanna, Walter's father, believed that perhaps his youngest son fell asleep in one of the wagons, and the driver never noticed the tyke in the back. Or perhaps Walter had secreted off to visit his favorite uncle near the Lake Pontchartrain lakefront. This, later, turned out to be untrue. Walter was nowhere to be found. Mr. Lamanna then contacted the police, and a full-scale search commenced. Every house in the French Quarter opened their doors and gates to their courtyards, but still, no Walter. Days went by, and authorities asked Peter Lamanna if there had been any demands for ransom. Mr. Lamanna stated that no ransom demand ever came to his residence. However, he related an incident 2 years earlier during the deadly yellow fever epidemic of 1905. A strange visitor rang the bell at the Lamanna residence at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. A young black man handed Mr. Lamanna a note. The barely awake undertaker unfolded the note, read it to himself, and then asked the young man who sent it. The young man then turned to leave without answering the question. Mr. Lamanna then threatened the young man that if he ever saw him again, he would kill him. Despite no demand for a ransom to return little Walter, the local newspaper speculated that the young boy became a victim of the hated and brutal Mano Nero, or the Black Hand. The Black Hand functioned as a group of enforcers for the local mafiosi, not only in the New Orleans area, but wherever an Italian conclave gathered within the United States. Local merchants would receive a letter from the extortioners threatening to perform a kidnapping, arson, or worse, the murder of a family member, if their demands were not met. The Black Hand preyed upon their own Italian people with reckless abandon. Because of Lamanna's reasonable modicum of success, his family would make a prime victim for the ruthless group, as well as other Italians who worked the streets of gold in pursuit of the American dream. But until some proof of the Black Hand's involvement, police suspicions remained just that, mere speculation. On June 10, 1907, Peter Lamanna finally received a note, but gave no indication to authorities of its contents. But he did say that the letter gave Lamanna instructions as to where to find his young son. The later disclosure of the note stated,
Mr. Lamanna, we beg you not to be displeased that your son is missing because he is in good hands. As far as eating, he eats good. Conditions are to send son. We demand a small pay, only $6,000. Certainly you won't miss that. You or your son, because we will send him cut into pieces if you don't pay the money. $6,000.
A second letter from the alleged kidnappers arrived and warned Mr. Lamanna not to call the police. Local citizens hypothesized in the newspapers that little Walter had become a victim of the Black Hand, and that authorities and citizens alike needed to finally rid the area of the hated organization. On June 11, 1907, Italian citizens from all over the city met at the Française Hall, determined to end the reign of the Black Hand in New Orleans once and for all. Even though Italians maintained a deep distrust for the authorities, Most of them knew that if they did not identify the culprits in the kidnapping of Walter Lamana, the terror would continue. Judge Philip J. Patorno, an influential member of the legal community in New Orleans, accused the police and their detectives of not being aggressive enough to find Walter Lamana. Patorno blamed the police department for not hiring enough Italian detectives whom the citizenry would trust just enough to divulge any information. As a result of the meeting of the Italian citizens, the Italian Vigilance Committee formed and vowed to search for young Walter, and in a move uncharacteristic of the population, cooperate fully with the authorities in search for the missing child. While the Italian Vigilance Committee met and determined a course of action, Peter Lamanna asked that some police officers go with him to try and meet the conditions set forth in the ransom notes. The small group of men set forth to Kenner, Louisiana, a small Italian conclave on the outskirts of New Orleans, where they were joined by more officers determined to find the young boy. This larger search party then set off towards St. Charles Parish, where Mr. Lamanna was to meet a man and receive further instructions. The entire sojourn produced nothing, and Peter Lamanna returned to his home without his son, much to the grief and disappointment of his bereaved wife. On the morning of June 12, 1907, Peter Lamanna awoke after a most harrowing day before to the news that a local Mafia chieftain, Tony Costa, was seen by witnesses with young Walter on the day of the child's disappearance. A frantic search ensued to find the elusive Costa. The Italian Vigilance Committee moved to find the perpetrators of the Lamanna kidnapping and assisted the police in rounding up the usual suspects. They felt that,
among this number they have the Black Hand artists, who have been making life a burden for them and are implicated in the kidnapping of the boy Walter Lamana, who is still in the hands of the villains.
The acting mayor of New Orleans, James McCracken, emphasized to the Vigilance Committee that any questioning to be done would be executed with authorities present. The more heinous the crime, the more the rights of the accused would have to be protected. Fears among the Italians that pervade most remembered what happened to the men accused of murdering police chief David C. Hennessy in 1891. A jury found for the defendants in the murder trial in 1891, and this in turn caused a mass meeting where, after being whipped into a frenzy, 10,000 people rushed to the old parish prison and lynched many of the men who, although acquitted of murdering Chief Hennessy, authorities brought them into the prison for their protection. The lynching caused an international incident, and for a time, the United States and Italy stood on the verge of an all-out war. The Italian government tried to claim that some of the murdered men were Italian citizens. In an act to avoid war, the United States paid an indemnity to the families of the murdered men. Still, Italians feared that someone accused of a crime may be dragged from a cell in the middle of the night and dispatched very quickly. Later, in 1896 and 1899, 9 more Italians thought to be with the Mafia were lynched without a trial. With the most recent past, the Italian consternation over trusting the authorities was very understandable. But now, the whites of New Orleans demonstrated a sense of community, as even the most successful citizens joined in the search for Walter Lamana. With a few suspects being questioned and the authorities actively searching for Tony Costa, Italians in the area learned that the wily gangster was hiding in plain sight. On June 14, 1907, Judge Patorno, who had taken a leading role in the apprehension of anyone who may have been involved with the kidnapping, went to Costa's residence with 2 police officers. As the group approached the front stoop, they noticed a young girl who ran inside when she saw Patorno and the officers approaching. Patorno and his police escort hurried across the street to the Costa residence and drew their weapons. They ran up the stairs and into Costa's room, where he struggled to get out of bed. Patorno shoved the man back down, held his pistol over the suspect's heart, and dared him to move. The police took Costa into immediate custody. During his questioning, the police made mention that several witnesses stated they saw Costa with little Walter the day of the child's disappearance when he bought some ice cream for the tyke. During the interrogation, the police also arrested an associate of Costa's, Antonio Sclafani. At the suggestion of District Attorney Chandler H. Lusenberg, police released all of the suspects with the exception of Costa. Although the suspects released walked away from the police station, apparently unmolested, The police placed full surveillance on them on a 24-hour basis. As Costa sat in jail, one of Costa's associates came forward and provided an affidavit asserting that Costa masterminded the kidnapping of Walter Lamana. On June 16, 1907, police then formally arrested the reputed Mafia leader with the kidnapping of the 7-year-old and then searched for accomplices. In order to keep Costa from communicating with any associates on the outside, police isolated the suspect so no information could come from the jail. Police theorized that Ignacio Campusano provided a wagon with which to secret Walter out of the city. Campusano then delivered the boy somewhere between Kenner and St. Rose, Louisiana, where the initial search began, and placed the little boy on a small boat to transport their quarry to the west bank of the Mississippi River. Because of his rendition of what happened to young Walter, police arrested Campusano as a principal accomplice of the crime. The day after Costa's arrest, he received a very interesting visitor, Peter Lamanna, and Detective John D'Antonio, who arrived at Costa's cell in the parish prison for a confrontation. Confronted with the potential victim's father, Costa maintained that he did not hurt anyone in Lamanna's family, and he did not know where his son may be. Although Costa admitted that he took Walter to the ice cream shop, he swore he left the boy there at approximately 7:45 p.m. on the night of the kidnapping. As he turned to leave the cell, Costa pleaded fervently that he had nothing to do with the little boy's disappearance. Lamanna showed no reaction as he left the cell and then finally the prison. On June 18, 1907, Peter Lamanna received another letter that hinted toward a man named Giovanni Barreca, who may have held information as to the whereabouts of his son and the particulars of the plan. After reading the letter, Mr. Lamanna made a statement to the local press.
I shall never see my son again. I could not believe that men could be so cruel. I have lost all faith in my brothers, and all that I can see ahead is years of suffering and misery, and perhaps a maniac's cell. If I only knew that poor little Walter was dead, my heart would not be so heavy, but the feeling that he is in the hands of the blacklegs, and perhaps being ill-treated and tortured, is driving me mad.
At dawn on the morning of June 23, 1907, police officers accompanied by Campusano searched the woods and swamps located near St. Rose, Louisiana. After an hour of silence, Campusano, sitting on a log with shackles on his hands and feet, confessed to the crime of kidnapping Walter Lamana and then pointed the way to where little Walter could be located. After wading through waist-deep water, Campusano led the authorities to the headless torso of a young boy wrapped in a blanket. Dr. Joseph O'Hara, the coroner of Orleans Parish, verified the remains as those of Walter Lamana. The torso lacked the arms, legs, and the head. The rest of the body would be located a few moments later with no doubt as to the identity. Campusano related what happened the day of Walter's disappearance. The young boy began to cry once the kidnappers brought him to the Campusano cabin in the woods near St. Rose. Of the 4 other accomplices that Campusano identified, one of them grabbed the boy and strangled him to death after Walter refused to cease his crying. Then the accomplices made the decision to dismember the body and dispose of it in the woods. Police learned that kidnappers lured Walter away from his home with promises of sweets. The coroner determined that young Walter must have suffered greatly prior to his expiring. After news of the discovery reached the local population, a witness came forward by the name of Jenny Garifo, and she stated that she witnessed Walter at the Campusano cabin, and one of the accomplices warned her to keep her mouth shut about what she saw or she would disappear. But when it appeared that authorities broke the conspiracy, this brave young woman came forward. On June 24, 1907, with information as to the culprits in hand, authorities arrested Lorenzo Gambaluca, Leonardo Gabbia, and Tony Gendusa, all suspected of belonging to the Mafia in New Orleans. Giuseppe Catasano and Mrs. Marie Campusano were arrested as well. 3 others, Angelo Incarcetato, Francesco Lucchesi, and Stefano Monfli, fled the jurisdiction when they learned of warrants for their arrest in connection with Walter's disappearance. Because of the volatile atmosphere surrounding the case, then Governor of Louisiana Newton C. Blanchard vowed to keep order and not have a repeat of the 1891 incident by placing the state militia on alert and ready to quell any disturbances. Governor Blanchard believed in innocence until proven guilty. On the same day as the arrests of Gambaluca, Gavia, Gendusa, Gattisano, and Mrs. Campusciano, the police arrested Angelo Monteleone, Gavia's brother-in-law, and Gavia's sister, Nicolina Gavia. Police believe that Francesco Lucchesi hatched the plot to kidnap the young Walter because he wanted money to marry Nicolina Gavia. Police further deduced that Frank Gendusa wrote the Black Hand notes. Once word that police made the arrest in the kidnapping and murder of his son, Peter Lamanna rushed to the Gretna jailhouse to confront the suspects. He swore that if the courts did not dispense justice in his son's case, he would do the job himself. Once the suspects were held in custody, Jenny Garifo elaborated on her initial facts. She stated she awoke one Sunday morning after the kidnapping and had to cut wood in order to make coffee for her father. While in the yard, she noticed two Italian men in Campusciano's yard, and one of the men held the hand of a little boy. The two men then took the young boy into Campusciano's cabin. Later that same day, Miss Garifo witnessed another man walk into the cabin, and then she heard the loud cries of a young child. The next day, Miss Garifo stated that she no longer heard the child's cries. Police later searched the Campusciano cabin and found a small hatchet that appeared to have bloodstains on it and a rope that appeared to have been used. Mrs. Campusciano acted as a lookout while Walter sat in her cabin. When the police questioned Mrs. Campusciano further, she divulged that her husband and his co-conspirators planned to kidnap 3 more children, those of well-to-do Italians in and around New Orleans. On July 4th, 1907, the suspects then became defendants in the kidnapping and murder of Walter Lamana. Appointed as their counsel, L. Robert Rivard realized he had a tough road ahead of him to defend the accused kidnappers/murderers. Costa would prove even more difficult to defend because he would not assist in his own defense. Additionally, Costa attempted to kill himself by rolling up a handkerchief and hanging himself. The effort proved unsuccessful. One of the most emotional incidents at the trial came when Mrs. Lamanna came to the stand and cursed the defendants. Their heads hung low, finally showing some sort of remorse. She fainted as she left the stand when she noticed that the bloody clothes that Walter wore the day of his kidnapping appeared as an exhibit on the prosecution's table. Also during the trial, Leonard Gavia desired to turn state's evidence and wanted to testify against his co-conspirators. The prosecution agreed to the testimony, provided that Gavia would be completely truthful in his rendition of the events. Gavia agreed and stated that he overheard a conversation between Campusciano and a man named Joe DePaula, who owned a farm close to the Campuscianos. Police arrested DePaula later after the initial arrest of the other accomplices. Gavia witnessed DePaula and Campusciano exchanging some words, and when he moved closer to hear more of the conversation, DePaula fell to his knees and begged Campusciano, "For Christ's sakes, don't give away on me." Campusciano commanded DePaula to be quiet and get off his knees, for the guards were returning. Campusciano then replied to DePaula that, "I'm not going to be hung. My wife is going to get hanged or sent to the penitentiary. What will become of my 2 children? Will you take care of them both and care for them the same as I would if I were in trouble?" DePaula said, "I swear." Leonardo Gavia's testimony proved damning to the defense, especially when he mentioned that he witnessed Costa walk off with little Walter from the ice cream shop, walk to the corner of Royal and Domain Streets, and place the boy in a covered wagon. Jenny Garifo, the witness who placed the principals at the scene of the crime, corroborated Gavia's testimony. On the second day of the trial, Coroner Dr. Joseph O'Hara testified that he examined the remains of Walter Lamana and performed the autopsy on those said remains. When he produced his findings before the court, O'Hara's recitations drew gasps from both the gallery and the jury box. Mr. Lamanna took the stand and repeated most of his wife's testimony. He had no outbursts, but Peter Lamanna looked like a man overcome with grief, pain, and disbelief as his testimony appeared incoherent at times. But the reaction from the gallery and jury could be felt throughout the entire courtroom as Peter Lamanna's voice shook with emotion. After an expressive testimony, both the defense and the prosecution rested their cases. Judge Edrington gave the jury their charge and stated that the penalty for murder was death. However, they could add the words "without capital punishment" if they found the defendants guilty as charged. 24 hours after considering all the evidence, the jury found Ignacio Campusano, Maria Campusano, Frank Gendusa, and Tony Costa guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Walter Lamana without capital punishment. However, and even though he gave evidence that helped convict the other defendants, Leonardo Gebbia would be tried at a later date along with his sister, Nicolina Gebbia, for the same crime. The citizens of Louisiana, especially at this explosive time in the state's history, tended to respond to verdicts of this type with extra-legal justice. The response to the verdict in this case was no different, but law enforcement and the governmental authorities of the state reminded the denizens that no incidents that have occurred in the past under such circumstances would be tolerated. The state militia received a call to protect the defendants, and especially the Gebbias, from any lynchings or jailhouse retribution. Many argued that to the seasoned criminals a life sentence meant nothing. The only justice they would understand and would serve as a further warning to perpetrators contemplating the same crime was nothing short of paying for their travesty with their lives. But detractors of the sentence stated that the jury obviously misunderstood Edrington's instructions, and the sentences would stand with the exception of one. Although there were cries for lynching, the act never materialized. After the jury's announced verdict, Ignacio Campusano finally admitted to what actually happened to Walter Lamana. After Peter Lamanna refused to pay the $6,000 ransom, Campusano admitted to strangling the young boy, but never confessed to the dismembering. The convicted murderer firmly believed that with his confession lay a commutation of sentence for his wife. On November 13, 1907, Leonardo and Nicolina Gebbia stood trial for the kidnapping and murder of Walter Lamana. D.A. Marrero brought Ignacio Campusano into the courtroom to testify against the Gebbias, although his testimony would not garner any leniency in his sentence. His testimony was limited, however, because Campusano refused to identify Gebbia as the man who ordered the death of the small child. As Campusano left the witness stand, escorted by an armed guard detail, he passed Peter Lamanna on the way out of the courtroom. Peter Lamanna swore that he would get the opportunity to kill Campusano at a later date. D.A. Marrero basically presented the same evidence against the Gebbias as he had against the other defendants at the previous trial. After a succinct proceeding, the jury found the Gebbias guilty of capital murder and sentenced the brother and sister to death by hanging. The verdict seemed strange to witnesses at the time due to the minor role that the brother and sister played in the entire conspiracy. Nevertheless, those who demonstrated sympathy for the victim's family determined the verdict just and true. Even though authorities believed that the principals responsible for the kidnapping and death of the 7-year-old Walter Lamana had received their just due, authorities failed to apprehend the other 4 suspects, and they remained at large. In September of 1908, after a denial of their appeal, a concerted petition drive began to commute the sentence of Nicolina Gebbia. 7 months had passed, and in 1909, the Louisiana State Board of Pardons granted the commutation of Nicolina's sentence. As for her brother Leonardo, there would be no commutation, and his sentence of death would commence. On June 16, 1909, Governor J.Y. Sanders signed Gebbia's death warrant and slated his execution for that very same day. At 12:30 on that Friday, guards from the St. Charles Parish Jail escorted Leonardo Gebbia, along with his priest, a Father Muret, to the steps of the gallows. Gebbia suffered some of the indignities of a condemned man, as the people present in the yard to witness his execution spat upon him and called him a baby killer. He hesitated at the bottom step, and then, as if a wisp of courage entered his small frame, Gebbia walked up the remainder of the 13 steps into the jail yard, where he finally met his executioner, H.M. Johns. Johns, an experienced hangman, placed Gebbia over the trap door, tied his legs and feet together, then placed the customary black hood over the condemned man's head. Johns then took the noose and fastened it firmly around Gebbia's neck, making sure that his neck would immediately break as the trap was released. Johns then looked to the sheriff, who then gave the signal to release the trap door. Gebbia suffered for almost 15 minutes as his neck did not break. Obviously, Johns did not secure the noose as he thought, and Gebbia suffocated to death. Whether Johns did this on purpose has been the topic of much speculation on behalf of historians since the hanging. Nevertheless, Peter Lamanna's wish of the suffering for his son's death visited Leonardo Gabia in his last moments of life. The other convicts saw their sentences reduced after only serving 11 years due to a law passed by the Louisiana state legislature that granted good time for sentences other than execution. They all walked out of Angola State Penitentiary sometime in 1918.